My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name's Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Hi, everyone. Today we are talking to Leora Fridman. Leora is a Jewish writer whose work is concerned with issues of identity, care, ability, and embodiment. Leora is the author of upcoming book Bound Up on Kink, Power, and Belonging, which she describes as an auto-theoretical journey through bondage, domination, and intimacy, in which Leora uncovers how Jewish historical trauma can be challenged and explored in embodied relations. We are so excited to talk with you about your upcoming book. When we got your email about it, we were immediately fascinated, and part of us was like, is this a spam email? Like, these topics feel so specific, what's going on here? So before we dive into the book, tell us a little bit about your work more broadly, what brought you to it, what people should know about you.
It's so funny that you said that thing about the spam email, because it's like nothing should ever be such a perfect match, because that would mean it was made by AI, you know?
Exactly.
It's just not possible. But I think that also that totally connects with, things that I'm interested in, themes of this book itself, because a lot of the things that I'm interested in are kind of like the cracked, the imperfect, and how they allow for intimacy. So aside from, thank you for that really thoughtful introduction, aside from those things that you described, but generally, I tend to describe myself as an educator, a curator, and a writer who works in a lot of different forms. And also each of those roles for me tends to kind of connect and interweave. I think about a lot how we can allow different forms into one another, just as we can allow different people into one another. And specifically, I think when it comes to creating, I'm really invested in collaborative work and relational work, as opposed to work that is made by like a single lone genius who we all know is fictional. So yeah, I tend to, especially in a lot of my recent work in nonfiction, I tend to address, as you mentioned, pretty complex topics, but often in kind of intertextual and intergenre forms, meaning that I work between the personal, the lyrical, the theoretical. I mix a lot of colloquial and theoretical or critical language. I'm really invested in creating nonfiction forms where readers can feel invited to connect with texts, like especially texts that they might not already feel like they have access to, like academic texts of different kinds. And invitation is generally a theme in my work, linking text, linking lived experiences, finding ways to curate conversation. So yeah, I started out writing primarily and first as a poet. An important note, I think, for my practice around that is that I grew up multilingual. I grew up in a Mexican Jewish family, and I grew up speaking English and Spanish and some Hebrew. And for that reason, I think that language was always a place for me of kind of productive instability, of multiplicity, of play, of constant retranslation between my world and my family and different members of my family and kin. And that led me to poetry in a certain sense, in that it kind of always felt like language was a really open and generative space. I moved into prose in a lot of ways in what I would describe as a kind of a golden age that we're living in, of kind of experimental nonfiction, experimental prose. And I moved into that realm, I would say, when I started to write more explicitly about disability and chronic illness, my own experiences of it and other people's experiences. I think because I wanted to deliver some messages more directly, some kind of political considerations more directly. And so I turned to prose for that reason. And my book prior to this one is a collection of essays about the politics of chronic illness, the art of chronic illness and disability. And that one kind of led into a lot of the concerns of what I'm writing about in Bound Up.
That's incredible. I was just like marveling over the amount of topics that you can bring together, and talking about this like nonfiction work and people, like inviting people in, and curiosity about lived experience, I think is just so incredible. And I know we've read a little bit about it in your email. I read a little bit about it online. I read part of an article that talks about like you working on the book, but tell us about Bound Up and what potential readers should know about it.
Sure. So I started writing Bound Up when I was traveling a lot for other work. I was traveling a lot between Oakland, California, where I was living at the time, and Berlin in Germany. And it was also a time where I was coming to understand myself as a white ally in Black-led movements against police brutality based in Oakland. And in those moments, I was very much identified and understanding myself as a white person, very much in a privileged position. And then going to Germany, considering some aspects of my Jewishness there, and really quickly kind of like getting cloaked in the perception of being a historical victim, a victim of state power, which felt like really strange and uncomfortable to me, and weird in a productive way, in that the kind of, I felt like my experiences around victimhood and oppressorhood, if we can say that, were kind of in this really switchy and strange space. So I think because I was going back and forth a lot, I started to be really aware of this dynamic, and I started joking with some German friends about like, oh, I'm your sad little Jew, like I'm your little victim, because I thought, we're all people invested in kind of the interrogation of race and trauma and critical thinkers. Like we can handle a little of like jousting and like discomfort around this. And also because I thought that humor could really destabilize something that for me felt like a very stereotyping, not rigorous consideration of victimhood and oppression. So kind of these jokes were not intended in any way, of course, to deny the Holocaust, but intended to understand that I am not living the Holocaust right now. I think humor can do a lot of work to situate me in the present tense, in what kind of like humor and jokes my body can tolerate to encounter what's really happening right now in the power dynamics of my time and my relationships. And Holocaust education, for me, like for many of us, had just been so laid so thick in my Jewish education. And I was really trying to figure out how to interact with that very true and important reality of some aspects of Jewish history, but also how to hold the fact that my position of power had drastically changed from that period of history and my ancestors who inhabited that period of history. And this kind of like joking first with a partner and then with some friends in Germany about like being a Jew and kind of like performatively taking on that role was what really allowed me to like consider the role of role play and kink, because it was such a kind of bombastic way of interacting with it. And I had some exposure to role playing kink beforehand, but then I was like, wow, I'm really kind of trying to take this on purpose. Like, how can I engage with this both intellectually and physically, because I'm really trying to like bring in a somatic and present understanding of power and race. So that was kind of the beginning of the book. One thing that I like to say that's important to me to say about the book, especially for readers who don't read a lot of creative nonfiction, is that, because you mentioned this word autotheoretical that we use in the description, meaning in this case that I'm working to develop theories of sexuality and culture and relation through my own experiences, with my own experiences, in addition to existing critical texts that I'm drawing on from cultural studies, from critical theories of race and queerness. And the character of me and my experiences in the book is, of course, true in certain ways to my own lived experiences, but it's also a character. It's also, and we can think about this in the context of role play too, it's also an aspect of my experience that I've kind of tried to pull forward in order to open new conversations, in order to engage readers in ideas that I want us to be thinking about together.
There's so many like pieces tying together in this book that I know ourselves and readers will be really interested to see how they all begin to speak to each other. I think something that feels obviously central is talking about your experience as a Jewish person in Berlin and the ways that your identity shifted depending on your geographical location. So with this in mind, how do you feel like Bound Up is informed by Judaism? How does it interact with Judaism?
Mhm. I think the book is less interested in Judaism and more in Jewishness, if we can make a distinction between those. I think it's specifically interested in the experiences of the cultural assimilation of white passing Jews in the United States and how we might re-examine the progress of that experience as we learn to become allies with other movements for liberation. The book is really interested in kind of updating Jewish understandings of power, updating particularly in the sense of trauma and PTSD and the ways that sometimes trauma causes us to get stuck in old stories that haven't necessarily caught up with current time realities. So it's really coming from a place of compassion and desire for healing and liberation of Jewish lives, among other lives. And I think the book is really trying to disinvest in trauma narratives that insist on militarization and defense as the only modes of power, as we see in the contemporary Israeli state. I think I wrote into my Jewishness in this book, as well as into other identities that I hold, because they're my entry points into conversation, to avoid appropriating. Not because I necessarily think that my life or my identity is more interesting or more valuable than other people's. I often joke with a lot of writer friends about how weird it is that I write nonfiction, because I don't actually think that my own life or my own story is like so interesting, but I really believe in it as ground for an approach to really rigorous conversation and investigation. I really believe that the personal can allow us to interact with one another more authentically, even when it means centering aspects of self that I also know to be kind of like unsteady and rife with confusion and reinvention.
I am thinking so much about what you're saying about this like difficulty to interact with victimhood narratives, like both from the perspective of people in the German community that you're around, but also like with ourselves as Jews, and difficulty to move through it and past it and like really process it. And I'm thinking a little bit about Dara Horn, who politically is a nightmare sometimes, but in her analysis of like the kind of glib, people love dead Jews and Adventures with Dead Jews podcast series she did, which I think she did get some criticism for kind of the lightness with which she approached it. She makes this point consistently that people prefer dead Jews because they're dead, and it's easier to be like they're victims, and it's so sad, and it's harder for people to deal with anti-Semitism today or Jews having opinions today or any of that. And I read an article she wrote about, a field trip of children somewhere in the Southwest, American Southwest, to a Holocaust museum. And by the end of it, a kid raises his hand and asks, like, are Jews still around today? Like dinosaurs or something. And she had this moment where she was like, what are we doing teaching the Holocaust to people who don't know Jews? And like, it does have this kind of fossilized experience. And anyway, this is not a coherent question. I'm just reflecting that what you're saying about creating like a living, breathing embodiment of Jewishness in a space in which Germans are uncomfortable, but also with ourselves. Like, do we as Jews prefer our own victimhood and our own historical victimhood to our power dynamics today?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're sharing. And I think that for me, this is where, and I say this in the book, like, I don't necessarily think my way of interacting with these experiences is everyone. And I give that caveat, especially when I get into kind of like more hardcore kink and role play stuff. But in terms of what you're saying, I think this is where for me, the elements of role play and BDSM became really rich territory, because I thought, like, to use the Dara Horn that you're talking about, basically what I was doing was saying like, okay, you want a dead Jew? I'll like play a dead Jew if that's what it's going to take to be in relationship with you. And like, again, not say that no one was traumatized or that no one was hurt or that no one was killed, but rather to say that like, that's a way that people have of framing or understanding Jews, and it's not everything, but if that's what they need in order to play, then like, okay, we'll play, you know?
Yeah, this is kind of in line with this conversation around like, yeah, it is kind of in line. Like characterizing oneself, both like within dynamics with other people, like in the concept of role play. But I also feel like the way that you are choosing to write is also a sort of characterization of self. Like the what you're describing, this auto-theoretical type of writing, creative nonfiction is, yeah, characterization of self. And so I'm curious what it is like to characterize yourself like that and how that maybe is a form of role play.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to use that with my students. It's such a good idea.
Yeah, I'm so glad.
No, I mean, it's, I think you've kind of said it. Like, that's how I understand it because I don't write traditional memoir. Like, I don't sit down and say, like, here is my life story fully. It's delivered to you as a product. It's a full story. What I'm interested in is taking, as I've said, fragments of life that allow us to interact with one another, to like moments of vulnerability or openness or like cracking open that allow us to like see versions of self. But I think I'm just very aware, both from my own political, ethical, spiritual training and from my life as a writer, that the self is a completely unstable entity. And so why would I write a book that depends on like a person staying from the same from beginning to end of a story? And if anything, I'm trying to write a book in which a person is constantly shifting. And, it's one thing I'll say, in terms of publishing a book like this right now, is that the events of this book end about 5 years ago. The events that are actually described in my own life in the book. And so you're seeing a character in this book who is learning a lot as she's going through certain years of her life. And I now don't necessarily feel exactly the same way about things that she feels in this book. And that can be like a really scary and vulnerable thing to have to inhabit as a writer, to show up in public in moments now and being like, oh yeah, she says some things in the book that I too disagree with, But to me, that feels like a much more exciting project than claiming a version of self that is completely static and that I pretend to be also now.
Thank you for that. I think that I feel like so much of our current online discourse, media discourse in general, really prohibits people from being their full, ever-changing selves, And it's like there are so many pieces and moments in time in my life, like in my actual lived life, that I have like said or done things that I would be like horrified to be associated with me today.
Yeah.
But that was me. That was me at a different point in time. And those were things that at that time felt true or right or okay for me to do or say or engage with. And so, yeah, I just think that this is like a really important and interesting way of engaging with that complexity. But I'm curious if there is like anything in specific you could speak to that comes up when you're talking about disagreeing with things that you as the character or the character that you wrote said.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are aspects of the book that are engaging with my own kind of growing understanding what it meant to be chronically ill and to ally myself with communities of chronically ill and disabled people, and specifically artists. And there are moments of shame or self-hatred that I chose to expose in the book, not unrelated to the ways that I expose shame or self-hatred about Jewishness, that I didn't put in there because I want people to like have more of that in their lives. I put it in there because it felt to me important to describing the process of liberation that I think is possible and human. But there are elements in the book of kind of like teenage fat phobia, of kind of descriptions of my own relationship to my Jewish body, to my hair, to my, certain Jewish stereotypes that, again, I fear misreadings of the book that are kind of like that I'm somehow promoting self-hatred. And God willing, there will be routes to liberation for people younger than me that do not include the exposure of those kinds of things. But again, to me, that's kind of a beckoning of other people to feel welcome in the work. And I think, I'm thinking about what you were just saying too about online culture, et cetera. And I think, when I think about my greatest utopic hopes for how exploring kink can be anti-oppressive, I'm really invested in this kind of like anti-purity conversation. There are elements in the book that talk about, there are a couple chapters in the book that touch specifically on different forms of historical purity, not just racial purity, but other forms of it, and how oppressive those are. And I think that I'm also interested from a Jewish lens and in a political sense in considering the role of victimhood there, and how being a pure and kind of pitiable victim is a very common stance that we have in order to feel good or seem good. And of course, I do not begrudge anyone naming their own victimhood for the sake of liberation. And I think that it's not the only route to being correct or belonging. And I think that we're stronger and capable of better than just kind of stopping where like the person who has the most amount of victimhood wins. I think especially in the sense like you were talking about, like we're all porous to the narratives that we were raised in, to the kind of social conditions we're inside of, which means we're often wrong, we're often unliberated, we're often liable to mistakes. And I think we can't wait to be perfect or pure in order to participate in organizing projects, in order to build relationships, in order to really seek out the kind of world that we want.
That is amazing and so needed. We need to hear that all the time. So glad we're recording this. And this is actually a great transition, I think, because we wanted to ask you about how anti-Zionism shows up and Bound Up. And I think we talk a lot about sometimes why Zionists cling to Zionism so tightly. It's because of this lack of imagination of what could come after and what could be different and what could evolve and come through if we acknowledge the ways that Jews are being oppressive in this time. So we know that you wrote this book pre-October 7th, and curious, how might it have differed if you had written it after? Or speak on anti-Zionism and Bound Up a little more generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you're touching on, I think one way that I understand the most violent, dangerous aspects of today's Zionism are as rooted in a really deep insecurity, that very unfortunately familiar Jewish story reinforced by various state projects, that as Jews, no one will ever take care of us. We're always under attack. We're the ultimate victims. Victimhood is static and unsolvable. So the only solution is to militarily and violently and endlessly defend ourselves at all costs. And even as I say that, whenever I say those kind of narratives out loud, I feel the sadness of them. I think a key part of those narratives is just singular and lonely, meaning also that it excludes people under the thrall of that narrative from coalition building, from collectivist projects, from connection to other histories of oppression and healing and liberation. And it makes me think, actually, I went to a talk a few weeks ago with Shalene Rodriguez and Molly Crabapple, in which there was a lot of discussion about what if we all have aspects of victimhood and dispossession in our lineages, and no one needs to own that narrative as the most, but that in fact histories of dispossession are ground for collective work, for connection? What if, our greatest strengths result from our need for other people, not just within, but outside of our identity groups as well? And I think a lot of my own learning around that also comes from disability worlds of disability justice, worlds in which I was able to learn that I could be deeply compromised, imperfect, sick, unable to get out of bed, and still extremely powerful. Powerful from a place of the submissive, to use, BDSM terminology. But I think really opening my own eyes to other versions of power, or other possibilities for power. I don't believe that nationalism will keep us safe as Jews. I don't think it has thus far. Again, I think, the muscular Jew, the Sabra, this image of strength at all costs, I think pushing away the idea that you could ever be weakened or be weakened again. This book is really working against those stories. And again, admitting that we are weak, we could be weak, we're porous to social conditions and narratives, and that we can build strength and solidarity from that place of intentional weakness, of known loss, even, as I was saying about the submissive, even performative weakness. I realize I didn't speak yet about October 7th specifically. And I think, like I said, this book, the events of this book end about 5 years ago. And I've, given the calendar of publication, I did not get to edit this book since October 7th. I think that one thing that's important for me to think about since October 7th is that we've seen mass mobilization and increased support for Palestinian liberation. But that's not new. It's just wider and happening more. And I think it's important not to have a story that this has only been happening since October 7th, because I think we owe a lot to movements that were going on before then. I think also in that wider concern, I have found more connection to a tapestry of actively diasporist Jews and Jewish artists. And I think if I were writing the book now, I would, take that into account more. I think maybe one other thing I'd like to say is that I think because I'm also a teacher, because I teach college, I was teaching this past spring during student uprisings. And it was a real honor to witness the deep sense of purpose in my students, the deep desire for belonging and for connection to mass uprising. And it was also a real challenge as an educator to figure out, like, how the hell am I supposed to keep teaching within the constraints of a class while this is happening? And I really had to rely a lot on my own capacity to be transparent with my students, to kind of like shift with them and have conversations with them about what we were going to do, what we both wanted to have happen. I wrote an essay also about the impossibility of non-neutrality in higher education right now while that was happening. And it really taught me a lot about how to even more let go of concerns of hierarchy in my expertise as an educator, of like needing to be the one in control in the room, which I've also learned from a lot of other educators. As just to note, because it's so important, I think my own teaching in the creative writing classroom is really influenced by Felicia Rose Chavez, who wrote the book, The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop, among a lot of other great pedagogical thinkers who are thinking about how to be less hierarchical, particularly in creative writing contexts, but also different theorists, including the writer Julietta Singh, who has a book about how kind of mastery and hierarchies of expertise in that sense are in themselves violent acts. So I think that's also been a big part of my learning since October 7th, has been another kind of submitting, another kind of giving in to what my training, my role, my professional background has to offer in this particular moment, and it may not be exactly in the form that it's been operating in thus far.
Thank you. I think it's so interesting to hear about your experience like being in the academic world this past spring or these past 11 months. And I think that in connection with these topics that you have been writing about that feel like they can be heavy or significant. We're curious if there are any spiritual practices that you use to bolster yourself, both in the work of writing, but also in the work of teaching and being a guide or a support or a comrade to the people who are learning from you.
I love this question so much. I love that you asked this question. I have a quip that I give often that friendship is my primary spiritual practice, which is both quip and not a quip. But I do think that the practice of dedicated friendship is a major bolster in my creative and personal life. I happen to be going through a particularly unsteady month with a lot of instability in my life and my housing situation, my family. And at first I was distressed and even angry that a lot of things were unstable in my life. As we've talked about, I definitely value vulnerability, but of course, I never really want to be the vulnerable one. I want other people's vulnerability to be given to me. But as I think, as this month has unfolded and friends have shown up for me over and over again to give me places to live and taken care of me and just made my life feel possible, I have become, in a way, I think maybe on brand, but like not grateful for the instability, but like integrating of this instability into my sense of meaning. I wouldn't be able to really have an understanding of what kinship and community care meant if I hadn't been made vulnerable in this particular way. But yeah, so friendship is huge, and also kind of relation generally. I generally am a person who like does a lot of bringing people together. I organize a lot of things in my home, in my professional life. I do a lot of like, whenever I come up against a particularly sticky concern in my work, I organize a reading group with people who I respect to read things and to think them through. And so those things are really important to me. I will also say that I think it's important to me to note that I was raised in a pretty secular, Reform Jewish household where I would say my strongest connection to Jewish life was through Zionism. And as I began to really interrogate the form of the Jewish state, I really came to understand, this was in my early 20s, that Zionism was like a primary faith system in my life. It was really giving me faith. It was an organizing faith. And it wasn't until I started to have a lot of those critiques that I really went in search of spiritual life, to kind of go back to your question, because I needed it, because I needed something else. I was really lucky in my mid-20s, especially, to find first in Western Massachusetts, where I was living, and then in the Bay Area in California, connections to a lot of renewal Judaism specifically, and earth-based Judaism. I have a lot of friends and comrades who are Jewish healers who are invested in ancestral reclaiming of different kinds. And specifically, I would say of spiritual life that's politically grounded and of this world, not subverting the difficulties of this world, the politics of this world. I'm thinking about people like Joe Kent Katz and Dory Midnight. And most recently, I've been going to Ray Himmelman and Alana June Margolis's grief work circles that they've been holding. These are a lot of people who are, I think, connected largely by networks of diasporist Judaism. So yeah, I feel really lucky to be connected to spiritual Judaism, but it's not something I grew up with. It's something that I had to find. And I think many of us who grew up in more secular Jewish households, assimilated households, had to find.
I really appreciate you framing it that way, because I definitely had a slightly religious Reformed Jewish household, but I think Alana and I reconnected over this idea of like, we grew up and now like, what else is there? Like, is there anything more to Judaism and Reformed Judaism than what we were taught in school? And the answer was like, of course there was, but it's that feeling of like, yeah, I know what's there. And then realizing we haven't even scratched the surface of like what Jewish spirituality and really religiosity even means is so exciting. And so I think I can definitely connect with that, like finding spirituality as like an adventure into Judaism in a new way when the old stuff just like isn't sustaining you Jewishly. I'm wondering if reconceptualizing Jewish trauma can help deepen our connections to Judaism.
I think that it's possible that there are people who can move through a human life without forms of faith or spiritual practice, because some people seem to be able to do it. But as I said, my experience was that Reform Judaism, and it's kind of, without being too mean about it, somewhat dry structures, and Zionism were really the things that were structuring a lot of my sense of identity and my relationship to language. Those were kind of the things that were really structuring my sense of identity. And I guess I'm saying, you know, maybe some people can do without faith, but for me, when one of them crumbled, I needed to find something else. And so I think, you know, of course, there's a long historied narrative of trauma, difficulty, crisis leading people to spiritual practice. But what I'm talking about is like a little bit more specific in that I think that I really needed to find a way to formulate my ethics and my capacity to be open to the world and my curiosity. And I think that a deepening connection to Jewish life has really allowed that for me. And I'm also aware, you know, I'm thinking about a conversation that I had with my father a number of years ago, who was raised in Mexico City, where there was one version, pretty much one version of Judaism available to him that he was educated in, which was pretty traditional Orthodox Judaism. And he is oftentimes pretty mystified when I talk to him about my Jewish spiritual life. It's pretty confusing to him, I think, not because he doesn't know that it's possible, but because it's not how he was raised to approach Judaism. And he said to me one time, and I was really moved by this, he said to me, you know, you're so lucky that you get to pick and choose, which I think we could, you know, experience as a slight dig, but I actually felt like it was a really tender thing to say, like, yeah, I'm really lucky to be alive in this moment where I get to choose how I want to connect to Judaism and how it can power my creative life and my politics. It also is informed by anti-assimilationist learnings from identity-based organizing and other forms that are not Jewish. And I will say also this Bound Up draws a lot on reports like J. Fredge's Understanding Anti-Semitism report and other related texts and other kind of organizing texts that really helped me to reframe Jewish life and its possible relationships to politics. And I think, you know, Bound Up also, when I was writing Bound Up, it's the first time in my life that I was seeking out Jewish funding for my writing life. And I found the New Jewish Culture Fellowship, which I'm now the director of, which is a new event I've taken over from the venerable Maya Ip, who was the founder of this amazing project of making space for boundary pushing Jewish artists. But in many ways, this weird, kinky project has made me much more Jewish than I ever was before. And I've had some funny conversations with scholars of Jewish art about how experimental radical Jewish art actually makes people more invested in their Judaism as opposed to driving them away from it. Because I think so many Jewish institutions are really afraid of Jewish artists because artists ask difficult questions and make experiments. And I'm a case in point of many that I think show that actually the opposite can be possible, that like allowing us to find our own way to Judaism can be a kind of rooting that's much stronger than any kind of enforced ideology.
100%. I think Jesse and I in our work with making benches and also just individually would definitely agree with that sentiment. In thinking about, as you described, this kinky book, how do you feel like exploring kink can help transform anti-oppressive spaces more broadly or open new opportunities for understanding?
Yeah, I think this returns to our earlier conversation about like purity in political spaces. And I owe a lot to my own investment in disability justice worlds as teaching me that I could be compromised and still belong, that I could be imperfect and still belong, and that in fact could be the ground from which I could belong, as opposed to waiting for my perfect political purity or perfect political understanding. And that feels really crucial to me in terms of how I approach political spaces. Again, not always a popular opinion, but I think one that a lot of us are working towards. I sometimes joke that I'm a bossy bottom, to use kink terminology or kind of different kinds of terminology, but I consider that to be, I think, a really actually good description of my aesthetics and my ethics, in that I'm interested in admitting when I'm wrong and that I am often wrong, but that does not mean I sacrifice my right to participate in the conversation or state my needs or desires or interests. That a purity, like we talked about, that a purity of rightness is not what I need in order to be in conversation with people or in coalition with people. I think I'm intentionally pushing this too far at many places in the book. I'm trying to be kitschy, kinky, goofy in order to performatively demonstrate my wrongness, in order to try to make space for the fact that that kind of figure could belong. I quote towards the end of Bound Up, I quote some work from Joanna Hedva, who's a thinker who's been really important to me in my own considerations, my own development of thinking. And Hedva talks about, they have this refrain that I quote in the book, "We are going to lose," in reference to political projects. Meaning that instead of waiting to win, like in a military sense, in a kind of competitive sense, winning over other people, what if we were kind of performatively enacting loss so that we can allow ourselves new and more rich possibilities for interaction? Hedva also talks about that specifically in terms of capitalism. Like they say, if the enemy is capitalism, we are going to lose, which I think some people don't agree with, but I find it a helpful thing to try on and to say, like, okay, if we're going to lose, if we're all going to be sick, if we're all going to die, like, what could we do then? It can be a really rich stance.
I love that idea. Okay, you've referenced your teaching, you've referenced the New Jewish Culture Fellowship. Besides Bound Up, tell us about any ongoing or exciting upcoming projects you have going on, and also where listeners can buy Bound Up.
Great. Bound Up is on bookshop.org. You can also buy it from the press, Wayne State University Press. You can find it, as I like to say, on Rhymes with Glamazon if you need to, if that's your only access point, but it's definitely not your only access point. In terms of projects, I always have a lot of projects, and it's hard for me to ever say which one they're always in deep rotation, so which one is most on the table right now. But right now I'm working a lot on sending this book out into the world. I'm really excited to be touring this fall and winter, primarily because, as we've talked about, I love having conversations with people. I love seeing what the book does with other people, so I'm really excited to be going a number of places to have public conversations with people who I think are each going to bring out different aspects of the book. I am working on a new book right now, which is about my next book of nonfiction is going to be about the term brain fog, which is a term that has been used for quite a while, but has come into increased prevalence, as I'm sure many of us are aware, since COVID-19. And the book is kind of investigating what brain fog is standing in for, why everyone I know has brain fog, but it's only described as an individual pathology that person has for a specific reason, as opposed to a social phenomenon, which it seems to me to be becoming. And it's looking at a couple different other historical moments in which a social condition was described as a pathology. One prime example that I've been working on a lot this summer is the history of the term hysteria, specifically at the beginning of psychoanalysis, and how the term hysteria was used to describe a social condition, what aspects of that were a social condition versus an individual embodied illness, and how those interplay. And I'm looking specifically at the example of Berta Pappenheim, who is better known as Anna O, which is her pseudonym that Freud and Joseph Brauer gave her in studies in hysteria. She's kind of considered one of the patient zeros of psychoanalysis. She made up the term the talking cure. She was diagnosed with hysteria and treated with the talking cure by Joseph Brauer. And she also, after her illness, grew up to become a really prominent feminist Jewish activist and prominent anti-Zionist of her time, which I think makes her, in a number of ways, a really interesting ancestor to me, both in terms of illness, the social conditions of illness, and political participation. I was in Vienna for 2 weeks this summer, specifically looking at her and looking at her archives and the history around her. So I have a piece coming out this fall that's like a small segment of that book that's about her, and then we'll be developing more about the history of brain fog and the contemporary use of brain fog over the course of who knows how long it'll take. It always takes a long time to write a book. But that's one thing that I'm working on a lot right now.
That sounds incredibly fascinating. I'm already excited for the next. We're also involved with a project that's centering Jewish anti-Zionist ancestors, and there's just like it's always like feels sacred and important to learn about new Jewish anti-Zionist ancestors, because it can feel as though there's not so many in the mainstream. So makes me even more excited about it, and I'm appreciative of you highlighting her.
Also, that period in, pre-war Vienna is a really important time for those ancestors, because we have a lot of actually like remaining letters of public discourse between people like Pappenheim and Freud himself and many other people who were openly discussing Zionism, anti-Zionism, what the right solution to the Jewish problem was. And it wasn't as much as it is today a terse or policed discussion. It was in some ways, but not in the same way as today. It was a moment in history where that was up for discussion. So I find it also really meaningful to consider that time.
Somehow we are already at the end of our time together. I feel like it's just flown by. I'm sitting here like I'm just listening to you. I don't even feel like I'm, conducting part of the interview. I'm just like, wow, loving everything that you're saying. But all good things must pause. So if you could leave our listeners with one message, what would it be?
In thinking about some of the things we've talked about today, I think the message would be that there's no perfect political place to reach, but that utopia is really in the messy, porous bodies, realities that are here now. And the questions that we have before us are really like, how do we find refuge in discomfort? How do we build community amidst apocalyptic conditions? How can we relate across different experiences of trauma? And how can we imagine or reimagine refuge as a place that's integrative of different lived experiences as they change, as history moves forward. I was just reading today a book by the philosopher Svetlana Boym, a Russian Jew. It was really important to me. And she has a line where she says something like, "What must be certain in order to tolerate uncertainty?" And I think that my way of extending that would be to say, like, what stability and relationship can we offer ourselves in order to strengthen our tolerance for uncertainty, because we're living in incredibly uncertain times, like most people have throughout history. But for those of us living now, these feels like incredibly uncertain times. So what do we need? What can we offer ourselves in order to live in that kind of reality?
Feels like such a perfect way to close what's been a really fascinating and insightful and informative conversation. And I hope it's felt that way for everyone listening too. We really encourage everyone to go and buy Bound Up or read any of Leora's other writing or books. And we will put in the show notes where you can buy Bound Up or where you can learn more about Leora on her website. But we just want to say thank you so much, Leora. It was so wonderful getting to talk to you, and we're so excited to see how your book is received in the world.
Thank you so much. Lots of appreciation for both of you and for everyone.
Thanks for listening to Making Menches. As an explicitly anti-Zionist grassroots org, we don't receive any institutional funding or support. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmenches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Menches, the podcast, is produced by Alana Lipkin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.